Welcome to my Bard's story.
Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us for another deep dive into God's Word. Today, we're navigating a really fascinating and often, overlooked passage, Genesis chapter 11, verses 10 through 32.
That's right.
Many people might just see a list of names here, but it's far more than that. This section is a crucial bridge. It connects the broad strokes of early human history, everything we've seen so far, to the very specific personal story of Abram, who becomes, the father of faith.
It's so true. It's really easy to just rush through genealogies, isn't it? Kind of skim them.
Absolutely.
But our study note reveals that this section is actually packed with profound theological insights, some really subtle narrative techniques, and vital historical context.
Yeah.
It's like the biblical author is carefully setting the stage for one of the most pivotal moments in salvation history. So our mission today is to pull back the curtain on these nuances, uncovering how God's sovereign plan unfolds, even through seemingly ordinary family records and, human struggles.
Exactly. We'll explore how the biblical author strategically crafts this narrative. You see it move from the rapid progression of Shem's descendants to a much slower, almost tension-filled introduction of Terah's family,
Right.
ultimately leading us to Abram. And we're going to discover how a barren woman and an uncompleted journey become the very backdrop for God's miraculous intervention.
Wow.
Offering some truly powerful lessons for our own faith and ministry today. Okay, let's unpack this.
Let's do it. Let's turn to our study note, starting with Genesis 11, verse 10 from the NLT. This is the account of Shem's descendants. 2 years after the Great Flood, when Shem was 100 years old, he became the father of Arphaxad. After the birth of Arphaxad, Shem lived another 500 years and had other sons and daughters.
Okay, so what stands out immediately here, right from the start, is the formulaic repetition in the Hebrew, especially with what's called the weokal verb form. It sounds like weoli lived and begat. And this creates a sense of rapid, almost relentless forward momentum. The author uses this grammatical structure, this perfective aspect in the original to foreground the narrative, quickly bringing us through generations. It's a series of quick snapshots, moving the story forward with a real sense of urgency.
I can certainly feel that pace when you read it that way. It just swiftly carries us from Noah's son Shem through 10 generations, straight to Abram's father, Terah. But for listeners who might just see a long list of names, what's the purpose behind using such a repetitive literary device? Why not just, say from Shem to Abram and be done with it?
That's a great question, and it's really key to understanding Genesis. This structure, it's more than just a list for memory. As scholars like Gordon Wenham point out, this 10-generation pattern is actually quite common in ancient Near Eastern texts.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah, like the Sumerian king list. So it's a deliberate literary device, not just for recording history, but to emphasize a historical pattern and God's consistent work within it. It shows his faithfulness to preserve a lineage, even amidst, a fallen world. It's about divine intention and preservation.
I see. So it's kind of a structural clue that something important is being highlighted here.
Precisely. And Kenneth Matthews highlights that the main function of this genealogy is really to bridge the universal context of Genesis 1:11, all that cosmic stuff, with these specific ancestral narratives that start in Genesis 12.
Okay.
It shows Abram isn't just some random figure appearing out of nowhere.
Right.
Instead, he's part of God's grand plan right from creation itself. It seamlessly connects cosmic history to a very personal redemptive story. It underlines the fact that God has been working behind the scenes preparing the way for this moment.
That connection between the universal and the personal really does help put Abram's story into perspective. Now, moving on to verse 12 through 26, which continues this lineage, you'll notice a pretty significant detail.
Yeah.
The lifespans are drastically decreasing.
Yes.
For example, Shem lived for 600 years, but by the time we get to Nahor, he only lives for 148 years and Terah for 205. That's a dramatic shift from the pre-flood eras. Even before the flood, the numbers were just so much higher.
It is a dramatic shift, and this decreasing lifespan is a crucial theological point, as John Walton notes. It's not just a numerical change. It reflects the deepening impact of sin and, humanity's increasing distance from that original state of communion with God back in Eden. The Great Flood acts as a clear divider. You see it right there in the numbers. After the flood, human lifespans just plummet dramatically. It underscores the severity of sin's consequences. It shows a clear decline in human vitality and maybe proximity to God's original design. It's a sobering progression, really.
It really is.
Yeah.
And yet, despite this decline, the genealogy still emphasizes the continuation of life and God's faithfulness to that original blessing. Be fruitful and multiply.
That's true.
It brings us directly to Terah, having Abram, Nahor, and Haran, marking a major shift in the narrative focus. But speaking of begetting, our notes also touch on what scholars call the interval problem in these genealogies. What exactly is that, and why does it matter for how we understand this?
Yeah, it's a really interesting point that often confuses readers. The Hebrew word yela, it's often translated begat or became the father of, but it can also mean became the ancestor of.
Oh, okay.
So Bruce Waltke points out that Luke's genealogy in Luke 3.36 actually includes an extra name, Canaan, between Arpachshad and Shelah in this very lineage.
Wow, I didn't realize that.
Yeah. So this suggests that the Genesis genealogies might occasionally skip generations or omit names, maybe to achieve a certain numerical symmetry like the 10 generations pattern we talked about, or perhaps just to focus on the key figures in the line.
Okay, so if the text isn't aiming for, like, a modern, precise chronological record, what is its primary aim, and why does that matter for our faith?
That's the crucial question. For us listening, the key takeaway is that whether there are literal gaps or not, the theological purpose and the historical continuity of God's redemptive plan through this specific line remain absolutely intact.
Got it.
The author's goal isn't a modern, precise chronological record like we might expect today. It's a theological narrative. It's highlighting God's faithful preservation of a chosen line leading to Abram. It's about the purpose and the path of salvation history, not just a historical roster. God is orchestrating events even through these seemingly simple lists.
Okay, that makes sense. Now let's move into the next segment, because here the narrative really begins to slow down and zoom in. We'll pick up with Genesis 11, verse 27 from the NLT. This is the account of Terah's descendants. Terah was the father of Abram, Nahor, and Haran. And Haran was the father of Lot. But Haran died in Ur of the Chaldeans, the land of his birth, while his father, Terah, was still living. Meanwhile, Abram and Nahor both got married. The name of Abram's wife was Sarai, and the name of Nahor's wife was Milcah. Milcah and her sister Iscah were daughters of Nahor's brother Haran.
See how the pace changes? This transition from that rapid-fire linear genealogy to a more detailed family history is very intentional. The narrative slows right down.
It really does.
And Haran's early death is highlighted as this unusual tragedy. He died in the presence of his father Terah, the text says, which implies a profound sorrow for the patriarch. This detail not only explains why Lot, Haran's son, would later travel with Abram, becoming quite a significant character.
Right, we see him later.
But it also adds this layer of sorrow and just human struggle to the family's migration story right from the start.
It certainly paints a more human picture of this family, doesn't it?
Yeah.
Not just names on a list. And the marriages of Abram and Nahor are mentioned, specifically Nahor marrying his niece Milcah.
Yeah, that often catches people's attention.
This practice of uncle-niece marriage, as Victor Hamilton notes, wasn't actually uncommon in the ancient Near East, especially for maintaining family purity and property within, nomadic or semi-nomadic society.
Cultural context.
Exactly. It provides important cultural context for understanding later marriages in Isaac and Jacob's stories, where they also marry within their extended family, sometimes relatives from Haran, actually. It highlights the cultural norms of the time while setting up the specific family dynamics. Now let's read the verse that introduces the central tension of this entire section, and really much of the Abrahamic narrative to come. Genesis 11, verse 30 from the NLT. But Sarai was unable to become pregnant and had no children.
Sarai was barren. She had no child. Just 6 words in English, but so powerful. This short statement, using the Hebrew adjective akwar, which describes a state of being, not just a single event, it abruptly halts the fast-moving narrative we saw earlier.
Yeah, it really does, like hitting a wall.
Exactly. It's a stark background detail that creates immense narrative tension. The promised lineage, which has been so carefully traced through 10 generations, now faces what seems like an insurmountable obstacle, right at the point where the next generation is supposed to emerge.
And in ancient Near Eastern culture, barrenness was, well, a deep shame, wasn't it? Even seen as a curse, sometimes a sign of divine displeasure. But this barrenness, it feels like such a huge roadblock. How does the biblical narrative consistently use these moments of human impossibility?
It's fascinating how the narrative shifts here. Gordon Wenham points out that barren women, think of Rebecca, Rachel, Hannah, Elizabeth later on, they often become the very stage for God's supernatural intervention.
Ah, that's a great point.
Sarai's barrenness makes Isaac's later birth entirely God's doing. It's a testament to his faithfulness and his power, not human capability. It foregrounds divine activity over human potential. The human no becomes the very canvas for God's yes.
Exactly. This sets up the core dramatic conflict. How will God's promise be fulfilled through a family that cannot naturally produce an heir? This is the central problem that Genesis 12 will answer. It establishes right from the outset that the fulfillment of God's promises hinges solely on his power, not on human ability or effort. It makes the miracle, when it comes, all the more evident. Now let's see how this journey actually unfolds. Okay, Genesis 11, verses 31 and 32 from the NLT. One day, Terah took his son Abram, his daughter-in-law Sarai, his son Abram's wife, and his grandson Lot, his son Haran's child, and moved away from Ur of the Chaldeans. He was headed for the land of Canaan, but they stopped at Haran and settled there. Terah lived for 205 years and died while still in Haran. So Terah initiates this journey toward Canaan. That feels like a hopeful beginning, and it's important to note the intentionality. The text says he was headed for the land of Canaan.
Right.
But then they stop in Haran, and he dies there. The journey is left uncompleted by him, which seems like a really significant detail given the intended destination.
It's absolutely crucial for understanding the transition to Abram. Bill Arnold sees Terah as a figure of maybe half-hearted faith, almost a warning for us. He started the journey, he took the initial steps towards the promised land, but he didn't finish it. He stalled out in Haran. And Kenneth Matthews describes Haran as kind of a comfort zone, culturally and religiously similar to Ur, where they came from.
Oh, okay, so it wasn't totally foreign.
Not entirely.
Yeah.
It was a comfortable stopover, a place where he could remain without fully stepping into the unknown of Canaan. And this contrasts so sharply with Abram's complete obedience in chapter 12. Terah's journey, initiated by man, ultimately failed to reach its destination. Abram's journey, initiated by God, ultimately succeeded. It demonstrates a crucial difference in their faith and commitment.
And this is where our study note raises that fascinating and often confusing timeline problem regarding Terah's death and Abram's departure. On the surface, the numbers seem to contradict each other, which, could be a source of confusion for readers trying to piece it together. How do we make sense of this apparent discrepancy?
Yeah, it's one of the most famous chronological puzzles in Genesis. Here's the puzzle laid out. Genesis 11.26 says Terah was 70 when Abram was born, or perhaps when he began to father his children, including Abram.
Right.
Genesis 11.32 says Terah died at 205. But then Genesis 12.4 tells us Abram was 75 when he left Haran. So if you do the math, if Abram was born when Terah was 70, then when Abram left at 75, Terah would only be 145 years old, 70 plus 75.
Right.
Which means Terah would have lived another 60 years after Abram left Haran.
But then, Acts 7.4 in Stephen's sermon, Stephen clearly states that God moved Abram after his father died.
Yeah.
So how do we reconcile this? It seems like a direct contradiction right there in the Bible itself.
You've hit on the key issue. The most widely accepted explanation, supported by scholars like Matthews and Wenham, is that the author of Genesis is prioritizing a thematic arrangement over strict chronology here.
Thematic over chronological.
The author strategically places Terah's death before Abram's departure in the narrative flow to conceptually close Terah's era and clearly open Abram's new one. It's like a literary device to highlight the changing of the guard. A new phase in God's redemptive plan is beginning, emphasizing that a new divine initiative is starting, independent of Terah's lingering influence or patriarchal authority.
So Stephen in Acts isn't necessarily giving a precise historical report down to the day, but rather a theological summary. He's emphasizing that Abram's full obedience and this new journey only really began after the end, symbolically speaking, of his father's era and authority. It signals a spiritual and historical break.
Exactly. It helps us understand the Bible's primary focus isn't always to be a modern history textbook.
Right.
And there's another really fascinating textual detail that Matthews points out. The Samaritan Pentateuch, which is an ancient version of the Torah, it actually records Terah's lifespan as 145 years, not 205.
Whoa.
Yeah. And if we use 145, the timeline aligns perfectly. Terah would have died exactly when Abram was 75 and left Haran. Now, this textual variant shows that ancient interpreters also noticed this issue and tried to resolve this apparent discrepancy. It reminds us that the Bible's primary focus is theological truth and the flow of salvation history, not necessarily a modern, hyper-precise chronological record. It's the story of God's redemptive work, and sometimes chronology serves that purpose, and sometimes thematic connections do.
Okay, we've really dug into the text itself, but what's truly surprising sometimes is how scholars unearth these deeper layers, these connections we might miss. From our notes, well, what's an insight that really made you pause and rethink what might seem like just a simple genealogy or family story?
That's a great way to put it, because these aha moments are what make studying God's Word so alive, aren't they?
They really are.
One insight that truly flipped my understanding comes from John Sailhamer. He proposes that the genealogy in Genesis 11 isn't just a bridge connecting Shem to Abram, but is actually functioning as a theological filter.
A filter. That's quite a concept. How does that fundamentally change our view of, say, divine judgment and grace in these early chapters of Genesis?
It's profound, really. Sailhamer suggests that through this highly selective genealogy, the author is essentially filtering out the themes of human fall, pride, like the Tower of Babel right before it, and the judgment that followed.
Right.
And what remains at the end of this filtering process is a pure, chosen seed, Abram. So the purpose of this genealogy, then, is to purify the narrative line, shifting the focus from accursed human history to the redemptive history that is about to unfold through Abram. It highlights God's meticulous pruning of humanity, preserving a chosen line through which his covenant promises will be fulfilled. It's moving past the universal failures to a very specific plan of salvation. It's an act of deliberate divine selectivity and grace.
Wow, that truly changes how we read it. It's not just a list, but a deliberate act of divine selectivity, an act of grace even in the midst of judgment. And speaking of deliberate acts, another really compelling insight comes from Bill Arnold, looking at Terah's half-hearted journey as a direct foil to Abram's faith. How does Terah's journey serve to highlight Abram's response?
Arnold depicts Terah as almost this tragic middleman. He wasn't completely faithless. Remember, he initiated the journey towards the promised land from Ur.
That's true, he started it.
But he ultimately stalled out in Haran, which, as we mentioned, Matthews describes as a comfort zone, culturally and religiously similar to Ur. It was a place where he could remain comfortable without fully stepping into the unknown. Arnold argues the author portrays Terah this way specifically to contrast him perfectly with Abram's unwavering faith in the next chapter. Terah's journey was initiated by man, stopped at convenience. Abram's journey was initiated by God, began in the unknown, and moved forward without hesitation or settling. This serves as a powerful warning for us. Human determination and initial enthusiasm, they're not enough to complete the journey of faith. It's about full reliance on divine leading and unreserved commitment.
That really brings a strong pastoral message to the seemingly simple narrative fragment. And there's a deeply human, even poignant insight about Haran, both the place and the person from John Sailhamer again. He suggests this tragic resonance between the place name Haran and Terah's deceased son, Haran. How does this linguistic connection potentially unveil a deeper psychological layer to Terah's actions, why he stopped there?
It's a beautiful and incredibly sensitive reading of the text. Sailhamer proposes this striking similarity in the Hebrew names is likely a deliberate literary pun. He speculates, and it's speculation but compelling, that Terah might have stopped in Haran because the place name itself constantly reminded him of his profound grief over losing his son Haran. So Haran the city becomes more than just a geographical location. It symbolizes Terah's unmovable sorrow. It's a place where his hope was perhaps buried, rather than being a stepping stone towards the promise. It adds this powerful psychological dimension to why he couldn't continue, suggesting maybe he was paralyzed by grief, unable to move past that painful memory associated with the name. It transforms the place from just a dot on a map to a profound symbol of a father's heartbreak.
That's truly a moving perspective. It adds such a layer of empathy to Terah's story, doesn't it? And how about this one from Robert Alter, linking Sarai's barrenness back to the Tower of Babel? It's a structural and theological contrast that, once you see it, completely reframes the narrative's flow right here.
Alter makes a brilliant literary observation. It's one of those things, like you said, once you see it, you can't unsee it. Sarai's barrenness in 11.30 serves as this subtle yet incredibly powerful reversal and correction to the Babel narrative in 11.1 to 9. Well, at Babel, humanity attempts to make a name for ourselves by building a tower, multiplying their numbers through their own strength, seeking collective immortality through human achievement.
Right, human effort.
And it leads to dispersion and confusion. Immediately following that story, the narrative zooms in on a barren woman, implying God's plan will now unfold through a seemingly futureless family, one unable to reproduce on its own. This suggests that God's way of salvation is the exact opposite of human pride. It doesn't begin with human capability or collective glory, but with human incapacity and a singular reliance on God's grace. It's a profound statement about humility versus pride and divine power versus human striving.
That really is an aha moment. It reframes the entire chapter, moving us from human ambition to divine intervention, from self-reliance to absolute dependence on God. Okay, finally, let's consider Nahum Sarna's emphasis on the cultural significance of Ur of the Chaldeans as a symbol of faith choice. How does understanding the religious landscape of Ur and Haran deepen our appreciation of God's call to Abram in chapter 12?
Sarna underscores something crucial. Both Ur and Haran were major centers for the worship of the moon god, known as Nana, or Sin.
Okay.
So Terah's journey was essentially from one moon god worship center to another. He moved geographically, but maybe not so much spiritually.
Oh, okay.
This means that when God calls Abram in Genesis 12:1 to leave his country, his people, and his father's household, it's not just a geographical command, it's a radical break. It's a complete cultural and spiritual separation from a deeply entrenched system of idolatry that Abram and his family were, well, steeped in. It emphasizes the absolute nature of Abram's commitment to follow the one true God. It was a call to exclusive worship in a deeply polytheistic world. This was a profound, life-altering spiritual decision, truly a step into the unknown in every sense of the word.
These insights truly deepen our appreciation for Genesis 11, don't they? Transforming it from maybe a mere historical record into this rich tapestry of theological truth. But for us today, especially those ministering God's word, how do these ancient stories resonate? Let's explore some vital messages and core teachings for believers and especially for pastors, revealing how these truths can maybe transform our preaching, our teaching, and our pastoral care. What's the first key message for us, drawing from these profound insights?
I think the first core message has to be about God's power manifesting in human impossibility. Sarai's barrenness in verse 30 is the ultimate human no. From a human perspective, it's just a dead end. As Gordon Wenham notes, God's redemptive plan often begins right at that point of human impossibility. This is such a profound reminder for us as pastors and believers. When we face our own weaknesses or ministry plateaus or seemingly insurmountable problems, whether it's a lack of resources or dwindling numbers or maybe spiritual barrenness in our congregations, these are often the very invitations for God to intervene in supernatural ways. Our impossible situations are God's canvas for demonstrating his almighty power, inviting us to rely on him completely.
So when we're praying for church growth or for really difficult family situations or for breakthrough in a ministry that feels stagnant, this passage tells us to maybe lean into the impossible, not shy away from it.
Exactly.
It shifts our focus from our limitations to God's limitless power. That empowers us to preach and live with greater faith, knowing that the Spirit works beyond our human capabilities and strategies. Okay, what's another crucial application that we can take from this passage?
A second vital lesson comes straight from Terah's story, the call to leave our comfort zones and complete the full journey of faith. Terah left Ur, but he settled in Haran, a place, as we said, similar to Ur culturally and religiously. It was a comfortable stopover. Kenneth Matthews points out that Terah walked the first half of the journey of faith, but failed to complete it. And this challenges us directly. Are there spiritual Harans in our lives or ministries where we've settled? Maybe a familiar church environment where we're comfortable but not growing, or a ministry role where we've stopped growing, or just a complacent mindset, unwilling to take risks or embrace new challenges for the kingdom.
That really hits home. As pastors, how do we encourage ourselves and our congregations to step out of those spiritual Harans and fully embrace what God has for them next? It's not always easy.
No, it's not. But Bill Arnold's contrast between Terah and Abram is so powerful here. True faith, the kind initiated by God, demands our complete and unreserved following, even into the unknown Canaan. So we need to preach and lead in a way that encourages our congregations to step out of spiritual complacency, to keep pressing forward in obedience, and to fully commit to God's calling, no matter how uncomfortable or unfamiliar it might feel. And crucially, we have to embody that full commitment ourselves, leading by example. It means continually asking ourselves, what is God inviting me to leave behind for the sake of greater obedience?
That's a challenging thought. A third profound message seems to be about God's sovereign providence throughout the long stream of history. While Shem's genealogy in verses 10-26 might seem dry, maybe even tedious to read through.
They can feel that way.
It's actually a powerful testament to God's unbroken sovereign care. Despite those decreasing human lifespans, despite the spread of sin and its consequences, God faithfully preserved his chosen lineage, from Shem all the way to Abram, without interruption. The line was never broken.
That's such an encouraging point, especially in chaotic or dark times when we might feel overwhelmed by the world's problems or, frankly, the struggles within our own lives and ministries.
Yeah.
It reminds us that even when our world seems to be spiraling out of control, God is still on his throne. His redemptive plan is progressing according to his timetable, step by step, often through seemingly ordinary individuals and families, working through both their strengths and their weaknesses. Our personal life stories, our church histories, they're all part of this grand unfolding narrative. This provides such a solid foundation for hope and perseverance in an unstable world. It allows us to preach with assurance and vision, knowing we are part of something much, much bigger than ourselves.
Absolutely. And if we connect this back to Robert Alter's insight about Sarai's barrenness and the Tower of Babel, we get a fourth, really powerful lesson. The transformative shift from pursuing human glory to embracing God's glory. Babel was all about humans trying to make a name for ourselves through collective achievement, right? A monument to human pride and self-sufficiency.
Building their own legacy.
But God's call to Abram promises, I will make you into a great nation. I will bless those who bless you, and I will make your name great. Genesis 12.
That contrast is stark. It's a profound reversal of values, a complete reorientation of our ultimate goal. The focus shifts from human effort and collective glory to God's sovereign election and his promise to an individual. For us today, it teaches that true value and meaning aren't found in building our own reputations, our careers, our achievements, or even, our church's reputation just for our own sake.
Right.
Our identity, our significance is rooted solely in God's grace and his calling on our lives. As pastors, we must consistently steer our flocks away from seeking self-glory and towards recognizing that our lives are meaningful only as they are built upon God's promises and lived out for his glory. That's a critical message in our often performance-driven world. It really is. Finally, a fifth crucial point, and one that's perhaps often overlooked, is the call to face and minister to family brokenness and grief with grace. Terah's family story isn't perfect, far from it. It's marked by tragedy with Haran's early death, unfulfilled dreams and the journey stopping short in Haran, and the deep, ongoing sorrow of Sarai's barrenness.
Yeah, it's messy.
And John Sailhamer's insight about the possible literary pun between Haran the place and Haran the sun so poignantly illustrates how a family can become stuck in sorrow, almost immobilized by loss.
This is such a powerful reminder for the church and for us as individual believers to approach those who are experiencing family brokenness, loss, or shattered dreams with immense grace and empathy. Faith isn't a path free of tears or suffering. In fact, the Bible consistently shows us that suffering is often part of the journey toward deeper faith. But it's precisely in these broken places that God's presence and healing can intervene most deeply. Think about it. Terah's unfinished journey and his place of death, Haran, became the very starting point for Abram's journey of faith. It shows us that even out of deepest sorrow, God can bring new beginnings and fulfill his purposes. It's a profound message of hope, right in the midst of very real human pain.
What an incredible journey through Genesis 11. It's truly a testament to how God's word, even in its seemingly less dramatic parts, is just brimming with profound insights for our lives and our ministries.
It really is. If there's one overarching lesson, perhaps it's how this passage masterfully prepares the stage for God's direct intervention in chapter 12. The intentional progression through the genealogy, that strategic pause at Sarai's barrenness and Terah's uncompleted journey, they all highlight one truth. God's grand plan of redemption thrives not on human capability or perfect circumstances,
Not at all.
but on his sovereign choice and the miraculous working of his grace, even through what appears to be human limitations and failures.
Yes, it absolutely underscores that God's faithfulness is not limited by our human limitations, or even our failures. The story of Abram begins in human impossibility, making God's eventual promise and fulfillment all the more glorious. It sets us up perfectly to understand that the father of faith wasn't chosen because of his inherent greatness, but because he was willing to trust in a God who specializes in the impossible, a God who brings life from barrenness and completion from stalled journeys. So for our listeners, especially those in pastoral ministry, maybe consider this. How might our ministries, our preaching, and our personal walk of faith change if we truly embrace the idea that God's greatest works often begin in moments of human inability or unfulfilled plans, much like Sarai's barrenness or Terah's stalled journey? What would it look like to really lean into those moments as opportunities for God to demonstrate his power, rather than seeing them merely as obstacles to be overcome by our own strength or ingenuity?
That's a vital reflection for all of us, isn't it? And it leads to the question, are we, perhaps like Tara, settling in a spiritual Haran? A comfortable place, maybe, that prevents us from fully stepping into God's ultimate call for us or our ministry? What old way of thinking, what idolatry, what comfort are we being called to leave behind? And what Canaan, what unknown territory of faith and obedience is God inviting us to pursue? Even if it feels uncertain or requires a radical break from the familiar, just as Abram was called to leave behind his family's idol worship. We need to reflect on what that full, unreserved commitment looks like in our own lives and how we encourage it in the lives of those we shepherd, urging them and ourselves to complete the journey God has called us to, trusting completely in his perfect plan and his unfailing power.